Commander Lyra Vosketh stood on the observation deck of the diplomatic station and watched the stars spin slowly past the windows, her silver skin glowing faintly in the dim light, as it always did when she felt irritated. And today she felt very irritated indeed, because today marked the first anniversary of her marriage to a human. She had never wanted this marriage, and she had made that clear to everyone who would listen, but the Valari High Council had insisted that the alliance between her people and the Earth Confederation required a symbolic union. And since Lyra came from one of the oldest families in the Empire, she had been chosen whether she liked it or not. The human they had selected for her was named Daniel Cooper, a logistics officer from some tiny place on Earth called Cedar Falls, and Lyra could not imagine a more disappointing match if she had tried for 1,000 years to find one. Daniel was everything the Valari considered weak and unimpressive, standing barely 6 feet tall, with plain brown hair and plain brown eyes, and skin that did not glow or shift colors to show his emotions, lacking any telepathic abilities or enhanced senses, or the centuries-long lifespan that her people enjoyed. When Lyra had first seen him at their bonding ceremony, she had turned to her mother and asked if this was some kind of joke, but her mother had simply shaken her head and reminded her that duty to the Empire came before personal happiness. That had been 1 year ago, and in that time, Lyra had made absolutely certain that Daniel understood exactly how she felt about their arrangement. She never introduced him as her husband at diplomatic functions, preferring instead to call him her political obligation, or sometimes simply the human when she was feeling particularly cruel. And she laughed openly with her Valari friends about his many shortcomings. Just last week at a reception for the Andorian ambassador, Lyra had stood in a circle of her colleagues and listed all the ways that humans were inferior to the Valari, while Daniel stood only a few feet away, pretending to examine a painting on the wall. "They live such short lives," she had said loudly enough for him to hear. "Barely 80 years if they are lucky, which means I will spend only a tiny fraction of my existence dealing with this burden before I am free again." Her friends had laughed, and Daniel had continued looking at the painting without any change in his expression, and somehow his lack of reaction had made Lyra even angrier than if he had shouted at her. That was the thing about Daniel that she could not understand no matter how hard she tried, the way he simply absorbed her cruelty like water soaking into sand, without ever fighting back, or even seeming upset. When she mocked his primitive homeworld, he would nod thoughtfully as if considering her points. When she compared his physical weakness to the strength of Valari males, he would agree that she was probably right when she told him that their marriage was a waste of her valuable time. He would apologize for the inconvenience and offer to stay out of her way. It was infuriating beyond measure. Lyra used her telepathic abilities to sense his emotions sometimes, hoping to find hidden anger or resentment that she could use against him. But all she ever found was a calm patience that made no sense to her at all. The only time she saw anything like passion from Daniel was when he worked on the small garden he had built on the balcony of their shared quarters. A ridiculous collection of earth plants that he tended every evening with careful attention. She had asked him once why he wasted his time growing things that would only die in a few months anyway, and he had smiled at her with that gentle expression she hated so much, and said that everything dies eventually, so we might as well create something beautiful while we can. Not known what to say to that, so she had simply walked away and pretended she had not heard him. Tonight, she watched him through the window of the observation deck, as he sat in the station's common area, reading something on his tablet. Probably one of the tactical manuals he seemed to find so interesting, even though he was just a supply officer who would never see combat. Other humans on the station treated Daniel with a respect that Lyra found puzzling, nodding to him in the corridors and stopping to chat with him in the cafeteria as if he were someone important, rather than an unremarkable man from an unremarkable planet. She had asked one of the human officers about this once, a woman named Patricia Hayes, who worked in communications. And Patricia had given her a strange look, before saying that Daniel was one of the good ones and leaving it at that. Lyra did not understand what that meant, and she had not bothered to ask for clarification, because she did not really care what humans thought about anything. What she cared about was getting through this marriage with her dignity intact and her career undamaged. And so far, she had managed both by keeping Daniel at a distance and making sure everyone knew that she was not happy about their union. Her strategy seemed to be working perfectly until the night everything changed. The night when the Kethfor Dominion emerged from the darkness between stars and turned Lyra's entire understanding of strength and weakness completely upside down. But that night was still 3 days away, and for now, Lyra simply stood on the observation deck, feeling sorry for herself, and wondering how many more years she would have to endure being married to a man she considered beneath her in every possible way. She did not notice Daniel glance up from his tablet and look at her through the window with an expression that was neither angry nor sad, but something else entirely, something that might have been understanding if she had bothered to look closely enough to see it. She did not notice the way he set down his reading and walked to the balcony to check on his garden, pausing to touch the petals of a flower that had just begun to bloom. And she certainly did not notice when he picked that flower and brought it inside, setting it in a small vase on the table, where she would see it when she returned to their quarters later that night. When Lyra found the flower, she crushed it beneath her boot, without a second thought, grinding the delicate petals into the floor as Daniel watched from the doorway with that same patient expression he always wore. He did not say anything about the flower then or ever, but he returned to his garden the next morning and planted another seed in the empty space where that flower had grown. Some things were worth nurturing, even when the world seemed determined to destroy them, and Daniel Cooper had learned long ago that patience was key, was its own kind of strength. Lyra would learn this lesson too, but not until she had seen her husband stand alone in a burning corridor, with nothing but a plasma torch, and refused to take a single step backward. That day was coming soon, and when it arrived, nothing would ever be the same again. The alarm came at 3 in the morning, station time, a screaming wail that tore through the corridors and dragged everyone from their beds with hearts pounding and hands shaking. Lyra was on her feet and reaching for her uniform before her eyes were fully open, her military training taking over as her mind struggled to catch up with what was happening around her. Daniel was already awake and dressed, which surprised her until she remembered that he often stayed up late reading those tactical manuals of his. And he handed her a cup of water without being asked as she pulled on her boots. "What is happening?" she demanded as she fastened her weapon belt around her waist. "The Kethfor," Daniel said quietly, his voice calm in a way that seemed impossible given the circumstances. "They have broken the neutral zone with approximately 200 warships, and our station is directly in their path." Lyra felt her blood turn cold at the mention of that name. Kethfor were the nightmare that parents used to frighten children into obedience, an insectoid species that had been silent for 3 generations while they built their forces in the darkness between stars. No one had known exactly what they were planning, but everyone had feared the day when they would finally emerge, and now that day had arrived at the worst possible moment, with only 12 defensive ships standing between the station and total destruction. Lyra ran to the command center with Daniel following close behind her, and when she arrived, she found chaos waiting for her, as officers shouted reports and screens flashed with warnings, and the distant sound of explosions echoed through the hull. As the highest-ranking military officer on the station, she immediately took command, barking orders that cut through the confusion like a blade through silk. "Launch all fighters in defensive formation," she commanded. "Begin evacuation protocols for all civilians, personnel, and get me a direct line to the fleet commander." The next 6 hours were a blur of desperate fighting and terrible losses, as the 12 defending ships threw themselves against the HFY armada with courage that bordered on madness. Lyra watched from the command center, as ship after ship was torn apart by enemy fire, their crews dying in flashes of light that she knew she would see in her nightmares for the rest of her life. By the end of the battle, only 4 ships remained, and the HFY had begun boarding operations, sending thousands of their soldiers through breaches in the station's hull to hunt down anyone who remained inside. Lyra grabbed a rifle and led her security teams to meet the invaders, fighting through corridors filled with smoke and screaming and the terrible clicking sound that the HFY made when they communicated with each other. The insectoid soldiers were everything the stories had warned about and more, standing 7 feet tall, with bodies covered in thick chitin that could stop most weapons fire, their 4 arms ending in claws sharp enough to cut through metal, their compound eyes seeing in spectrums that other species could not even imagine. For every HFY that Lyra and her warriors killed, 10 more seemed to appear from the smoke to take its place. Her telepathic senses were overwhelmed by the dying thoughts of her people, waves of fear and pain and desperate final prayers crashing against her mind until she could barely think straight. She had never known true despair before this moment, but she felt it now. A cold certainty settling into her bones that told her this was the end, and nothing she did would be enough to stop it. Then the reports started coming in from the lower decks, and everything changed. Someone had sealed the emergency bulkheads in Corridor 9 manually, trapping 200 HFY soldiers in a section with no escape. On the other side, gained precious minutes to get civilians to safety. Someone had rigged the atmospheric systems in that corridor to flood it with industrial coolant, killing every single one of those trapped soldiers in a matter of seconds. Someone had then moved to Corridor 12 and done the same thing, and then Corridor 15, creating a trail of frozen HFY bodies that stretched across the lower half of the station. The name attached to those reports made Lyra stop in the middle of a firefight and stare at her communicator in disbelief. Daniel Cooper, the quiet logistics officer she had mocked for 3 years, the unremarkable human from the unremarkable planet, had just killed over 400 enemy soldiers by himself, using nothing but his knowledge of the station's systems and his apparent willingness to walk straight into danger. "How is this possible?" she whispered to herself as another explosion rocked the corridor around her. Officers heard her question and answered with something like awe in his voice, saying that Cooper had apparently memorized the entire technical specifications of the station during his off hours and knew every system better than the engineers who had built it. But knowing systems was not the same as being willing to use them while enemy soldiers hunted you through darkened corridors, and Lyra could not understand what would drive a man she had considered weak to take such insane risks. She would find out soon enough when she tracked him down to Corridor 17 and saw with her own eyes what her human husband was truly capable of. The battle continued to rage around her, but Lyra barely noticed anymore because all she could think about was getting to Daniel before the HFY did. She ran through smoke and fire and the bodies of the fallen, her silver skin flashing with colors she could not control as emotions she had never felt before surged through her heart. Fear was there, yes, but also something else, something that felt almost like pride, mixed with a terrible guilt for all the years she had wasted treating him as less than he deserved. When she finally reached Corridor 17, she found him building a barricade from cargo containers, welding them together with a maintenance torch, while behind him, 400 civilians huddled in terror, waiting for escape pods that were still cycling through their launch sequences. The HFY were coming, and everyone knew it, but Daniel Cooper stood between them and the people he had sworn to protect, with nothing but determination in his eyes and a nearly empty rifle in his hands. Lyra had never seen anything more terrifying, or more beautiful, in her entire 500 years of life. Lyra approached the barricade with her weapon raised, scanning the corridor for threats as she moved toward the man she had spent 3 years trying to avoid. Daniel looked up from his work when he heard her footsteps, and his face showed no surprise at her arrival. Only that same calm patience she had always mistaken for weakness. The maintenance torch in his left hand still smoked from the welding he had been doing, and in his right hand he held a standard-issue plasma rifle that she could see was nearly empty of charge. "What do you think you are doing?" Lyra demanded as she reached his position and crouched behind the barricade beside him. Daniel checked the charge on his rifle before answering, his voice steady, despite the distant sounds of battle echoing through the station around them. "The escape pods need 20 more minutes to finish cycling," he said. "And there are 400 people behind us who will die if the HFY break through before then. So, I am going to make sure they do not break through." Lyra stared at him, as if seeing him for the first time in her life, because this was not the meek and unremarkable human she thought she knew. This was someone else entirely. "You will die," she said, and the words came out harsh because she did not know how else to say them. "Probably," Daniel agreed, with a small shrug that seemed impossible, given the circumstances. "But 400 people will live, and that seems like a fair trade to me." "This is madness," Lyra insisted. "You are a logistics officer. You have never seen real combat. You cannot possibly expect to hold this position against an army." Daniel smiled at her then, the same gentle smile he had given her 1,000 times before, when she had said cruel things to him. And something about that smile made her chest ache in a way she did not understand. "I have read every tactical manual in the station database," he said. "I know the HFY better than most soldiers who have fought them. I know this corridor better than the engineers who designed it, and I know that sometimes the only thing standing between innocent people and death is one person who refuses to move." Lyra opened her mouth to argue, but before she could speak, the sound of plasma torches cutting through metal echoed from the far end of the corridor. The HFY had found them, and they were coming. Daniel turned his attention back to the sealed door that the enemy was cutting through, his body tense, but his breathing steady, and Lyra realized with sudden clarity that he was not afraid. She was terrified, her hearts pounding so hard she could feel them in her throat, but Daniel seemed almost peaceful as he waited for what was coming. "I am a warrior of the Volari Empire," she said fiercely. "I do not flee while others fight, so I will stay here with you, and we will die together." Daniel shook his head without taking his eyes off the door. "Are a commander with 400 lives depending on your leadership," he said. "Those people need someone to organize the evacuation on the other end. Someone who speaks 50 languages and knows interstellar law and can navigate the politics of getting refugees to safety. They do not need another rifle. They need you." Lyra wanted to scream at him that she did not care about politics or languages or anything else except staying by his side in this moment. But she could not say those words because she did not understand where they were coming from. 3 years of contempt did not simply disappear in an instant, and yet something fundamental had shifted inside her. As she watched this quiet man prepare to sacrifice himself for people he had never even met, the orange glow of plasma torches grew brighter as the HFY cut deeper into the door, and the sound of their clicking communication grew louder. "Daniel," Lyra said, and her voice cracked on his name in a way that surprised them both. "I have been cruel to you. Every single day of our marriage I have been cruel, and you did not deserve any of it." "I know," he said simply, but there was no anger in his voice, no accusation or bitterness, just acceptance. "Why did you never fight back?" she asked. "Why did you never tell me that I was wrong about you?" "Because you were not ready to hear it," Daniel said. "And some things cannot be forced. They have to grow in their own time, like flowers in a garden. Lyra felt tears burning in her eyes, an experience so unfamiliar that she did not immediately recognize what was happening, because Valari rarely cried, and she had not done so since she was a small child. "I wasted so much time," she whispered. "Then do not waste any more," Daniel said. "Go save our people and live a life that matters." The door began to buckle inward as the HFY finished their cutting and prepared to breach the corridor. Lyra knew she only had seconds to make a decision, and part of her wanted to stay, wanted to fight beside this man she was only now beginning to understand, wanted to prove that she was more than the cold and cruel person she had been. But Daniel was right, and she hated that he was right, because it meant leaving him here alone. She pressed her forehead to his in the Valari gesture of deepest respect, a greeting reserved for honored warriors and beloved family members, and she felt him lean into the touch for just a moment before pulling away. "Go," he said, and his voice was gentle, but it was also an order from someone who had finally decided to stop being patient. Lyra went. She ran through the corridor toward the evacuation bays, with tears streaming down her silver face, her telepathic senses reaching back toward Daniel, even as the distance grew between them. She felt his calm determination like a warm light in the darkness, and she held on to that feeling as the sounds of battle erupted. Behind her, the HFY had breached the door, and Daniel Cooper stood alone to meet them. Lyra did not look back, because she knew that if she did, she would never be able to leave, and so she ran faster than she had ever run in her life, toward the 400 people who needed her to be strong. Behind her, the sound of plasma fire mixed with the terrible clicking of the HFY and the crash of bodies against metal. She whispered a prayer to gods she was not sure she believed in, and kept running. Daniel Cooper had never been a soldier, and he had never pretended to be one, having grown up on a small farm in Iowa, where the biggest threat he faced was whether the crops would survive the winter. He had enlisted in the Confederation Logistics Corps because it paid for his education, and because he liked the idea of making sure supplies reached the people who needed them, never imagining that he would one day stand in a burning corridor, waiting for an alien army to break down the door. But life rarely went according to plan, and Daniel had learned long ago that the only thing a person could truly control was how they chose to respond when everything fell apart. The door collapsed inward with a crash that shook the floor beneath his feet, and the first wave of HFY soldiers poured through the opening like a tide of chitin and claws. Daniel activated the emergency lighting system he had rigged earlier, setting it to strobe at 15 cycles per second, based on his research into HFY physiology. The effect was immediate and dramatic as the insectoid soldiers stumbled and crashed into each other, their compound eyes unable to process the rapid changes in light, their formation dissolving into chaos before they had taken 3 steps into the corridor. Daniel raised his nearly empty rifle and fired 12 careful shots into the massive bodies, aiming for the joints between thorax and abdomen, where he knew the chitin was thinnest. 8 HFY soldiers fell and did not rise again, and the others scrambled back toward the door as they tried to understand what was happening. The rifle clicked empty, and Daniel dropped it without hesitation, drawing the maintenance torch and positioning himself between the 2 cargo containers he had welded together earlier. The gap between them was only wide enough for 1 attacker at a time, the same principle that had allowed 300 Spartans to hold back a Persian army at Thermopylae thousands of years ago on Earth. Daniel was not a Spartan, and he had no illusions about being a great warrior, but he knew that history was full of ordinary people who had done extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. The HFY came again, more cautiously this time, and the first soldier to reach the gap thrust a clawed arm toward Daniel's throat with enough force to tear through metal. Daniel sidestepped the blow and drove the plasma torch into the creature's compound eye, feeling the sickening crunch as the heat burned through tissue and bone. The soldier fell, and another took its place immediately, slashing at Daniel's shoulder with claws that tore through his uniform and the muscle beneath. The pain was incredible, white-hot and screaming through his nervous system. But Daniel did not fall. He grabbed a cargo hook from the ground and jammed it into the joint of the creature's arm, twisting with all his strength. Something cracked, and the limb went limp. The third and fourth HFY came together, trying to overwhelm him with numbers, and Daniel killed one with a desperate thrust of the torch, while the other opened a gash across his chest that sprayed blood across the barricade. He could feel himself weakening as the wounds accumulated, his body running out of the reserves it needed to keep fighting. But the timer in his head kept counting down the minutes until the evacuation was complete. 15 minutes, then 10, then 5. The HFY kept coming and Daniel kept fighting, his world narrowing to the simple mechanics of survival, as he blocked and struck and bled and refused to take a single step backward. He lost track of how many he had killed, but the bodies were piling up in front of the gap, making it harder for the living soldiers to reach him, creating a barrier of their own dead that slowed the assault. His left arm stopped working after a particularly vicious blow caught him in the elbow, the bones shattering in a way that he knew would never heal properly, even with the best medical care. He switched the torch to his right hand and kept fighting. His vision began to fade at the edges as blood loss took its toll, the world going gray and distant, like a dream that was slowly dissolving into nothing. He kept fighting. A claw caught him in the leg, and he fell to one knee, barely managing to block the follow-up strike that would have taken his head off if it had landed. He kept fighting. The communicator in his pocket crackled with Lyra's voice, distorted by static, but still recognizable as she confirmed that all escape pods had launched, and all 400 civilians were safely away from the station. Daniel smiled through the blood that was running down his face, because the numbers finally added up, and his job was done. The HFY soldiers in front of him hesitated when they saw that smile, their compound eyes fixed on the human who should have been dead a dozen times over, but was still somehow on his feet. Something passed through their ranks, a chemical signal carried on the air that their species used to communicate emotion, and for the first time in their long history of conquest, the HFY learned what fear felt like. This one creature, this soft and fragile being from a species they had dismissed as barely worth conquering, had killed 57 of their warriors with nothing but improvised weapons and sheer determination. The soldiers at the front of the assault began to back away, their clicks and chirps taking on a tone that Daniel recognized from his studies as alarm and uncertainty. The ones behind them pressed forward, confused by the retreat, and for a moment the corridor dissolved into chaos as the HFY argued among themselves about what to do. Daniel used that moment to pull himself back to his feet, swaying but upright, plasma torch still clutched in his bloody hand. "Come on," he said through cracked lips, his voice barely a whisper, but somehow still carrying through the corridor. "I am still here." The HFY did not come. They sealed the corridor from their side and left him there among the bodies of their fallen, too broken to chase them, but too stubborn to die. Daniel stood alone in the silence that followed, surrounded by the evidence of what he had done, and he laughed, because it was the only response that made any sense. The laugh turned into a cough, and the cough brought up blood, and then Daniel Cooper finally allowed himself to fall, his body crumpling to the floor as the adrenaline faded and the full weight of his injuries crashed down on him. He lay there in the darkness, listening to his own ragged breathing, and he thought about the garden on his balcony and the flowers that would need someone to water them. He thought about Lyra and the way she had pressed her forehead to his before she left, the Valari gesture of deepest respect that she had never given him before. He thought about 400 people who were alive right now because he had refused to move. The thoughts grew dim and distant as consciousness slipped away, but Daniel was still smiling when the darkness finally took him. The Confederation relief fleet arrived 6 hours after the last escape pod launched, emerging from slipspace in a blaze of light that scattered the remaining Kethvor forces like leaves in a storm. Lyra watched from the command deck of the rescue ship as the enemy vessels fled into the darkness, her silver skin dim with exhaustion and grief as she refused to allow herself to hope. She had felt Daniel's presence fade through her telepathic senses during those long hours of waiting, the warm light of his consciousness growing dimmer and dimmer until she could barely sense it at all. The rescue teams boarded the station within minutes of securing the area, moving through the damaged corridors with weapons raised and medical supplies ready. Lyra went with them despite the protests of the other officers, pushing past debris and bodies until she reached Corridor 17, where she had left her husband to die alone. What she found there made her stop in her tracks. Her breath catching in her throat as her eyes struggled to process what she was seeing. The corridor was filled with Kethvor bodies, dozens of them piled in front of the gap between the cargo containers where Daniel had made his stand. The walls were scorched with plasma burns and splashed with alien blood, and the floor was littered with improvised weapons that told the story of a desperate fight that should have been impossible to survive. And there, lying in the center of it all, was Daniel Cooper. He was not moving, and for one terrible moment, Lyra was certain that she had arrived too late, that the quiet man who had taught her the meaning of true strength was gone forever. Then one of the medics shouted that they had a pulse, weak but present, and Lyra felt her heart start beating again as hope flooded through her like sunlight breaking through clouds. The next 3 weeks were the longest of Lyra's 500 years of life, as she sat beside Daniel's bed in the medical bay and watched the Valari doctors work to put him back together. His injuries were catastrophic by any standard, with 17 broken bones and massive internal damage and blood loss that should have killed him a dozen times over. The human body was not designed to survive what Daniel had endured. But the human spirit apparently had not received that message because his heart kept beating, despite everything the universe had thrown at it. Lyra used every favor she had ever earned, and every connection her family possessed, to get the best Valari medical technology brought to bear on saving her husband. The doctors worked around the clock, using techniques that were normally reserved for the highest-ranking members of Valari society. And slowly, Daniel began to heal. He woke on the 21st day, his eyes opening to find Lyra sitting beside him, with her hand wrapped around his. Her silver skin was pale with exhaustion, and her hair was tangled from too many nights spent sleeping in a chair. But when Daniel saw her face, he smiled that same patient smile he had always given her. "You look terrible," he whispered, his voice rough from weeks of disuse. Lyra laughed through the tears that were streaming down her face, the sound harsh and broken, but also filled with more joy than she had ever felt in her life. "You are one to talk," she said. "You looked like raw meat when they pulled you out of that corridor." Daniel tried to shrug and winced at the pain the movement caused, his body still far from fully healed, despite all the advanced technology that had been used to repair it. "How many?" he asked. Lyra knew what he was asking without needing clarification. 412 civilians made it to safety, she said, plus another 200 crew members who escaped on the last shuttle. All because you held that corridor long enough for the evacuation to happen. Complete. Daniel closed his eyes and let out a long breath, and Lyra could see the tension draining out of him as he processed the information. "Good," he said simply. "That is good." Lyra tightened her grip on his hand and leaned closer to the bed. her forehead almost touching his. "I have been a fool," she said. "For 3 years, I looked at you and saw weakness because you did not have telepathy or strength or a long lifespan. But I was wrong about everything." "You were scared," Daniel said, opening his eyes to look at her with that gentle understanding she had always mistaken for passivity. "Your people live for 500 years, and mine live for 80, if we are lucky. You did not want to love someone you would lose so quickly." The words hit Lyra like a physical blow because she had never admitted this truth to herself, had buried it beneath contempt and distance rather than face the fear of loving someone who would leave her so soon. She whispered. "Because I paid attention," Daniel said. "Because I saw you watching me when you thought I was not looking. Because I felt the way you pulled away every time we started to get close. And because fear of loss is the only thing that makes sense of how hard you tried to push me away." Lyra pressed her forehead to his in that gesture of deepest respect she had given him only once before. And this time she did not pull away. "I will love you for however many years we have," she said. "I will spend every day earning the right to stand beside someone like you." "You already have that right," Daniel said. "You always did. I was just waiting for you to see it." They stayed like that for a long time, foreheads touching, hands intertwined, two people from different worlds who had finally found their way to each other through fire and blood, and the kind of courage that has nothing to do with how long you live. The Battle of Station Threshold became a legend. Years that followed, studied by military academies and celebrated by poets who sang of the human who taught the Kethvor fear. But Lyra never cared about the legends, because she had something better than stories. She had 42 years with the man who grew flowers on their balcony, and never raised his voice, even when she was cruel. The man who had looked at an army and decided that 400 strangers were worth everything he had. When Daniel finally passed at the age of 83, Lyra was holding his hand just as she had held it on the day he woke from his injuries. She carried his memory for the 4 centuries she lived after, tending the garden he had planted, and telling his story to anyone who would listen. Not the legend of a hero who stood alone against an army, but the story of a quiet man from Cedar Falls who loved deeply and forgave easily, and taught a proud warrior that true strength has nothing to do with how long you live. Matters how you choose to spend the time you have.